What research methods should be used to evaluate whether something should be implemented in our schools or not?
There's always more things you want to do than you have money for. And then the question is, how do you decide?
It's not like we had questions that didn't have answers and now we have answers. They have contributed to an ongoing process of debate and evidence that has existed for a long time.
The evolution and the change has happened both as a result, I would say, of internal evidence, external evidence, and internal discussions on the experimentation and the experiences that you see on the ground.
There is a role for us to play in data and in assessments.
Professor Lant, what are randomized controlled trials?
A randomized controlled trial is just a technique for evaluating the impact of anything you might want to do, whether it's at the school level, at the system level, at the student level, and then you randomly allocate who is going to be exposed to the treatment or intervention and who isn't going to be exposed. And it's an important tool for eking out of the reality what was the true causal impact.
So the gold standard would be to have a randomized control trial where you can have this completely random treatment control. Now, even if you don't have that, you can still do much, much better, okay, than simple cross-sectional comparison. So if you look at in Andhra Pradesh, where we collected data on almost 40,000 children learning outcomes year after year after year for 5 years. Now, what you can see is for every year at the baseline, I know what learning level the child entered with. And at the end of the year, we know what they're leaving with, okay? So over 5 years, we know how much learning gain has happened each year. But each year, there has been a difference in the inputs available, okay? So you have moved from, say, a more qualified teacher to a less qualified teacher, or you have moved in a place where the school now has built an extra compound wall. Some infrastructure has been added. So what you can do is you can look at the correlation between the value added, right? Like, what's been gained that year with a whole bunch of these other changes that have happened. Now, that's not as good as a randomized experiment, but it's a lot better than just comparing levels.
There's several famous RCTs. Esther and Michael Kramer and I think Pascal Dupas did an interesting study in Kenya of contract teachers. And by being able to randomize which students were exposed to the contract teachers and the non-contract teachers, they could get an estimate of the impact of contract teachers. Now, if you ask me, did that answer the question of contract teachers? Well, that's a little strong. We had had at least a dozen evaluated experiences of contract teachers, and everything that they found with respect to contract teachers was already relatively well known in the literature. So you really would say we're more confident in the answer that we already had.
Has independent evaluation of your programs helped you grow in your fundraising?
On measurement, research is a big word, but if I just say measurement, we have an internal team and about 100 people team who helps Pratham programs measure it themselves. Now, coming up with a common measurement framework across 20 states in itself has a lot of negotiation that has to be done. Having it be as easy as possible, so that, how much of your time and money should go into measurement.
Right.
Measurement is really important, but you can't have a 50% going into that, then, where wouldn't you? So, we've tried to keep it at a 5%, between a 5 and 10%. What is that? What is 5% of anyone's time? Right. It's difficult to calculate. But I think that even in that exercise, we look at, two broad buckets: outcome measurement and process measurement. And I would say that we've done far better on outcome measurement. And now our outcomes are very simple, ability to, very USR-like. Process measurement is a lot more difficult, and I think it needs much more methodological skill to do justice to anything deeper.
We are asking a much deeper question, which is what was the impact of this, not whether the program was delivered, right? And to get an impact, you need to first have clarity on what are the outcomes that you're hoping to affect. Okay, so it could be, say, attendance because you're getting fed. It could be nutrition, and then hopefully there's some impact on learning outcomes. Now, in practice, what will happen is the governments will rarely have baseline data, okay, on these outcomes, and they'll just start the program. Now, even if you got lucky, okay, let's say there was an NSS round that happened before, and you had some data. And you said, we launched midday meals in 2003, let's look at these outcomes 5 years later, okay, and see, have there been an improvement in these indicators, okay? Now, the problem is that those 5 years are also a period of rapid economic growth, okay? Right. So there is thousands of other things changing at the same time, right? Yeah. So parental incomes are changing, attitudes are changing, tastes are changing, awareness is changing. And so maybe even if you got an improvement, maybe this would have happened anyway. Maybe this had nothing to do with your midday meal program, okay?
Right. What are some of the biggest challenges you faced in this realm of student learning outcomes, and how has this changed over the years?
I think when we think of assessment tools, we should be thinking of the array of assessment tools. We should be thinking of, because anytime one says data and evidence, I want to say data about what, for who, right? So I actually think on all fronts you can do much better. So one of the question is, and I think this is going to illustrate how all of this, by the way, has to be wrapped into the way the system thinks. So, one set of assessment tools is, are teachers getting feedback that assess the child's conceptual understanding of the points being taught in a way that provides him and her feedback as to whether this student is improving. There, I think, groups like Education Initiatives and other are, in fact, they might not be to laser sharp, but they're getting to sharper tools for saying, what are the conceptual underpinnings that I'm trying to convey in order that this child have a skill or capability? And how do I assess whether or not that child's has reached those conceptual understandings in a way that they can apply the skill? And what does that feedback loop have on how I'm teaching that child?
I think assessments, we all see that the assessment scene has really, I would say, almost exploded, and maybe there's too much assessment now. But I think there's also an understanding that we need for our conditions to try different kinds of methods of doing assessment. How people are arguing and on how assessment leads to action, I think, has also broadened. So maybe ASER was started a little too early, although I don't think so, but I think it has taken 10 years for us to reach where we are.
If you were to ask me, have we done enough over there? That's one part of the ecosystem, or that's one part of the entire development dialogue in education in India, which is still an underdeveloped area. Do we have enough data available with us, and not just data, do we have enough insights available with us which can inform not just existing work but generation of work that has yet to come? We definitely don't. Do we have these available publicly? Definitely not. Are newer organizations starting off at a higher point in terms of creating their own repository of insights? We don't. And so this is a very underdeveloped area of work altogether. And till that's the situation, there is a role for us to play in data and in assessments.